This short presentation provides an account of how two non-historians, a geneticist and a librarian, came to tell the story of Charles Darwin in Australia. Way back in January 1983, in the middle of a very hot, dry Australian summer, Jan and I drove across the Blue Mountains. During that hot, tiring drive, there was no air conditioning in cars then, we recalled having read that Charles Darwin had had a similar experience. Obviously not in a car, but on horseback, crossing the Blue Mountains during a very dry, hot Australian summer many years ago. When we got home, we found the source of our memory, a book entitled Darwin and Huxley in Australia, written by Jock Marshall and published in 1970, a year after his untimely death. Jock had been Foundation Chair of Biology at Monash University. Upon rereading this book, we were reminded of how good it is. It provides an excellent summary of the Australian experiences of both Darwin and his contemporary Thomas Huxley. At the same time, we realised that Marshall had told only part of the story of Darwin's visit. Indeed, we soon realised that the full story of Darwin's visit to Australia had never been told. We also realised that the 150th anniversary of Darwin's visit, that is 1986, was only 3 years away, and that there would be considerable celebration to mark that anniversary, as there had been on the centenary of Darwin's visit. From her time working in the pictures section of the State Library of New South Wales, Jan realised that the State Library had a wealth of information and artworks directly relevant to Darwin's visit. And Frank soon discovered that Darwin's Beagle Diary had long since been transcribed and published, that UK geologist Gordon Chancellor had begun transcribing Darwin's notebooks, and that in 1974 a small team at the University of Cambridge had begun to gather, catalogue and transcribe the thousands of letters written by and to Darwin. Why would a geneticist and a librarian venture into a major history project? Having spent a large portion of my academic career understanding what other scientists have done and then retelling their stories to students, I saw no reason why I could not do the same for Darwin's visit to Australia. And Jan's first-hand knowledge of the rich resources of the State Library of New South Wales, in addition to her well-honed critical faculties, made such a project all the more feasible. In what was then the pre-internet age, it was a very challenging task to gather all the relevant information. Writing letters to the UK, obtaining and reading microfilms, transcribing Darwin's handwriting, having maps drawn to show Darwin's movements, obtaining photographs of text and illustrations. By 1985, we had made sufficient progress for me to commence giving talks on Darwin's visit to Australia, illustrated with two remote-controlled 35mm slide projectors, the coordination of which, with two handheld clickers, proved to be quite a challenge. The twin projection enabled Darwin's text to be shown alongside illustrations of the scenes described by Darwin. These talks resulted in invitations from the Weekend Australian to review new Darwin publications, a biography of Darwin, and the first published volume from the Darwin Correspondence Project. Also by 1985, to help cover the costs of what we hoped would be a book including all the relevant artworks, we had received generous financial assistance from the Royal College of Surgeons of England, the then custodians of Down House, Darwin's home in England, the Royal Society and the Utah Foundation. And of course, as mentioned in the second presentation, from the very generous anonymous donor from Melbourne who made it possible to publish the book. Also by then, after our many dealings with Elizabeth Imesheff, now Elizabeth Ellis, and Arthur Easton at the State Library of New South Wales, it was agreed that the library should mount an exhibition in January 1986 as part of the celebrations of the 150th anniversary of Darwin's visit. So 1986 began with an exhibition called Charles Darwin Down Under 1836 in the foyer of the State Library. Another highlight of 1986 was a commemoration of Darwin's walk along what is now called Jamison Creek at Wentworth Falls in the Blue Mountains. Darwin did this walk on the 17th of January 1836. The 1986 commemoration occurred on the closest Saturday, which happened to be the 18th of January. The commemoration was instigated and organised by Dr. Peter Stanbury, then director of the Macleay Museum at the University of Sydney, and artist Venita and Reynes Zusters, whose house studios adjoined the route of Darwin's walk. The celebrations commenced with many of the attendees retracing Darwin's walk along the creek. Not far from the end of the walk, Mayor Peter Quirk unveiled a plaque declaring, "Charles Darwin passed this way in 1836, remembered by his friends 1986. Then, to just about everyone's surprise, Darwin himself, actually actor Tim Elliott, came out from behind a rock above the plaque and read from Darwin's description of the walk. Later, back at the Zusters' house, I gave the Charles Darwin in Australia illustrated talk. The next day, Sunday the 19th of January 1986, ABC Radio National's Occam's Razor presented a recorded talk by me on, you guessed it, Charles Darwin in Australia. There were other Darwin celebrations in 1986. Australia Post issued a first day cover, now selling on Amazon for $6.95. 3 years later, the first edition of our book was published by Cambridge University Press. In 2002, by which time the first edition was out of print, a paperback edition was published. Finally, in anticipation of the Darwin anniversary year of 2009, 200 years since his birth and 150 years since the publication of Origin of Species, a second hardcover anniversary edition was published in 2008. In the years that followed the 1986 celebrations, I continued giving lectures on Darwin's visit. In 1998, I was asked to review the first volume of Janet Brown's biography. In 2009, there were many public events and several documentaries to do with Darwin. I appeared in the Australian section of the TV documentary Darwin's Lost Paradise, a joint Australian-German production. Among many lectures that year, one was on Darwin's experiences in Australia at a Darwin symposium held at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra. And another was at the Athenaeum Club in Melbourne with Chris Darwin, a great-great-grandson of Charles. I also gave another Occam's Razor talk on ABC Radio National, and on the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birthday, I was interviewed for an hour by Margaret Throsby on ABC Classic Radio. In 2011, I was asked to review a very interesting book on Darwin in Galapagos. A few years later, I wrote 2 articles in the Conversation e-newspaper, one on remarkable genomic evidence published in 2015 to do with Darwin's finches, and the other, a summary of Darwin's visit to Australia, written in 2016 to mark the 180th anniversary of his visit to Australia. In the current year, 2024, with our book now out of print, we have created this YouTube channel and have put together this series of presentations, telling the story of Darwin's visit to Australia. We hope you have enjoyed the story.